Now let's shift gears slightly and go the opposite direction. We're going to start with mood and figure and reconstitute the schema and then assess validity using both Venn diagram and the rules. In other words, fallacies, right? So how we will reconstruct the schema is, let's write the mood out here to be a guide. Now, because we know that S and P have to occur in the conclusion, we can just write that out first. Some S is not P. That's an O. Now, where do the M's go? Because it's the fourth figure, so this is the first figure, second figure, third figure, fourth figure, the M's are going to be shaped like this. So you see that that's the shape, right? Okay. Now we put the major term in the major premise, minor term in the minor premise, and now we just use the mood to fill in the rest of the information. So for the major premise, we have no P is M. For the minor premise, we have some M is not S. So there's our schema. No P is M, some M is not S, therefore some S is not P. Okay, let's start with the rules this time. Why not? Do we have an existential fallacy? Or another way to ask that is, do we have a conflict of the Aristotelian and Boolean interpretations? No, because we have one universal premise, but the other is particular, so it doesn't cause a problem. We don't have universal premises with a particular conclusion. So now what about negation? Are there negations in this syllogism? Yes. If so, then we need to have exactly one negative premise and a negative conclusion. Notice, we do have a negative conclusion, but what's our problem here? Our problem with the premises is we have too many. So what is it called when you have two negative premises instead of the requirement that you have exactly one? It's called the fallacy of exclusive premises. So there's a fallacy. That one fallacy alone is enough to disqualify the argument from being valid. So we already know that the argument is invalid because it's committed the fallacy of exclusive premises. But since this is a review and a sort of practice, let's go ahead and apply the distribution rule just so we get a little practice in. Is the middle term distributed at least once? Well, this is an E, so that's a distributed subject, distributed predicate. That's an M, that's distributed. So yes, the middle term is distributed at least once. Now look at the conclusion. We have undistributed subject and distributed predicate. How do I know that? Because it's an O. That's the pattern for O. So we see that the major term is distributed in the conclusion, so it must be in its premise, and it is, so it checks out. So we don't have a violation of the distribution rules, but again, it doesn't matter because we have a violation of the negation rules that generates the exclusive premises fallacy. Now, for completeness, let's go ahead and diagram this argument. It's got a lot of marks on it, but we'll just have to sort of try to see through that. So we already have the schema. What we need is no P is M, generate some shading. So no P is M is going to have this shading to indicate this region is empty. Now we need to put definite X's. Is the M that is not an S a definite X? The M that's not an S. Yes, but it's because of the shading here that we know exactly where the M that's not an S goes. It goes in this region. So there's our M that's not an S. What about this diagram? Does it require the conclusion to be true? Obviously not, because the conclusion needs an S that is not a P, which would have to be in this region if there were going to be one, and that's nowhere near the x that we actually have on the diagram. So again, this argument is invalid. What's good about doing it both ways is you can see that these reinforce each other because the result you get from the Venn diagram should always match the general result of applying the rules. The difference is that the rules tell you exactly what went wrong in the argument because we can diagnose exactly what the fallacy is. Good. Let's do another mood and figure, this time OIA. Now, what I'm going to do this time is illustrate how we can apply the rules without even looking at the schema, especially the existential fallacy and the negation rules, okay? So let's start with existential fallacy. These are the premises, and this is the conclusion. The two premises are O and I, which are both particular. So clearly we do not have universal premises and a particular conclusion. So there is no existential fallacy. What about negation? Do we have any negations in this syllogism? Yes. What do we have? We have exactly one negative premise, but look at the conclusion. It's affirmative. So what is it called when we have exactly one negative premise but an affirmative conclusion? It's called the fallacy of affirmative conclusion. The complete name is the fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. But we shorten it down to affirmative conclusion. Now, it's a little harder to do the distribution rules just by looking at a mood. With a little practice, you can get pretty good at that. But what we want to do at this stage is let's go ahead and fill in the schema, and then we can do both the distribution rule and also the diagram. So the conclusion is going to be all S is P. We know where the M's go because it's the first figure. We'll go ahead and put them in. The major term goes in the major premise, minor term in the minor premise. And now we just fill in the quantity and quality based on the type proposition. So we have some M is not P, and the I is some M is, some S is M. A little inadvertent conversion going on there. All right, so there's our schema. Some M is not P, some S is M, all S is P. So is the distribution rules. Is the middle term distributed in at least one premise? The distribution pattern for O is undistributed subject, distributed predicate. So that's a problem. The pattern for I is undistributed, undistributed. So that's a problem. So there's another fallacy. We have the undistributed middle fallacy. Now, what about the illicit major or illicit minor? The minor term is distributed in the conclusion because the distribution pattern is distributed subject, undistributed predicate. So is the minor term distributed in its premise? And the answer is no. So what we have, why no? Because the minor term is undistributed in the minor premise. So in addition to these two fallacies, we also have the fallacy of illicit minor. So you can see that a syllogism may commit more than one different fallacy by just breaking a bunch of rules, right? But once again, it only takes one violation of one rule for the argument to be invalid. Okay, now let's do the diagram. Before we even start the diagram, let me make a sort of philosophical point. So just look at the mood. We have two particulars, and the conclusion is universal. Now think about this. For this diagram to require the conclusion to be true, there's going to have to be shading on it, or else the conclusion won't be represented because the conclusion is universal. But let me ask you this. Where is that shading going to come from? Because there is no shading for particulars, and so we're not going to have any shading on the diagram. We're just going to have X's, right? So you can tell just kind of by looking that this diagram is never going to do the job of making the conclusion true because there'll be no shading. But if we were going to go ahead and just do the work, what we need is that there's no shading, so we go on to definite X's. Is the M that is not a P definite? No, the problem there is we don't know whether it goes inside or outside the S circle, right? So it's not definite. What about the S that is an M? It's not definite either. We don't know whether it goes in or out of the P circle. So what we have is we have two indefinite X's, and it looks like this. That's the S that is an M, but we don't know whether it goes in or out of the P circle, so it's a fence sitter. Now we need the M that is not a P. That's another fence sitter on this fence. So what we have in the diagram is two indefinite X's, no shading. And so clearly this diagram is not going to be able to require that the conclusion is true, which means it's invalid, which of course we already knew because we have three different fallacies to choose from. Okay, good. Now let's do one last mood. We can do the same thing. This time what I'd like to do is reconstitute the schema, do the Venn diagram first, and then identify any fallacies that are committed. So we'll start by reconstituting the schema. So we have A, I, O. The O is going to be some S is not P. Where do the M's go? They go in this shape. So that shape, right? Okay. Major term goes in the major premise, minor term in the minor premise. Now we fill in the quantity and quality based on the type. The major is an A type, so that's going to be all P is M. The minor is an I, so that's some M is S. So there's our schema. All P is M, some M is S, therefore some S is not P. Now let's do the diagram. So we have shading for the major premise, all P is M. So we'll shade this region of P outside of M. There we go. And now we have some M is S. Some M is S would go in this region overlapping M and S. And notice there's no shading to force that X into a specific region bounded on all sides. So that's an indefinite X. There are no other X's to put on the diagram, so we're just stuck with an indefinite X. So let's go ahead and put it on. All right. Now, ask yourself, does this diagram as we have drawn it with the information from the premises, does it require the conclusion to be true? Notice it allows the conclusion to be true because there might be an X in the region of S outside of P, but the diagram as it stands doesn't require it. Because the X we have on the diagram is a fence sitter, it might actually end up being a P. So we can't definitively say from the information on the diagram that the conclusion must be true. So the diagnosis is invalid. Now, what about fallacies? Well, we've already I hope you've noticed that we don't have an existential fallacy because we have a particular premise as the minor, so we can't have an existential fallacy. What about a violation of the negation rule. Are there negations in the syllogism? Yes. We have a negative conclusion, but both the premises are affirmative. So this is the fallacy of drawing a negative conclusion from affirmative premises, or negative conclusion for short. So it violates at least one rule. Now let's see if it violates another rule. Is the middle term distributed in at least one premise? So this is an A, so that's distributed, undistributed, so that's a problem. An I is undistributed, undistributed, so that's a problem. So it also commits the fallacy of undistributed middle. What about illicit process? The conclusion is an O, so we have an undistributed and distributed predicate. This is potentially a problem, except that in this A, the major term is in the subject position, which is distributed, so it checks out, not a problem. So we've identified two different fallacies that explain why the argument is invalid: the fallacy of negative conclusion and also the fallacy of the undistributed middle.